You've got to remember that a modern battlefield, as we've seen in Ukraine, is transparent. Your troops can't move. Their locations will be known. Uh, the drones are constantly surveilling. So you're going to need some really quite smart uh, uh, technology, digital technology.
Cyber attacks on states such as Russia and China, becoming the first minister to speak so explicitly about launching a cyber offensive on another country. More than £1 billion will be spent on artificial intelligence and a hacking team as part of the British military's new Cyber Command. Sir David Omand, who served previously as a director of GCHQ, joins me now to discuss this. Sir David, welcome to the programme.
Good evening. Good to be with you.
No, it's great to talk to you about this. I was struck by it when I thought to myself, okay, this sounds different. Explain how different it is, this notion that we are going to attack other countries using cyber.
Well, take a step back. 5 years ago, the then government announced setting up a national cyber force. And this is a joint enterprise between GCHQ, my old department, and the armed forces with support from the other intelligence agencies. And the government was quite explicit that the job of this new force would be to be able to conduct, to change adversary behavior by exploiting their reliance on digital technology. So everything from hacking through to providing information which might mislead them, lead them to feel less confident about the information they had. And we actually saw this in operation, and the government did at the time acknowledge that this force was used against the so-called Islamic State. And they were hacking into the relevant servers. They were disrupting the flow of those appalling beheading videos that the terrorists were trying to put onto social media. And they were actually getting into the communication systems of the Islamic State fighters themselves, so that they couldn't any longer trust the kind of messages thought they were getting from their own commanders.
Well, it's
so
one
a huge
thing,
advantage.
It's one
so
thing, Sir David, to hack successfully the Islamic State. What about a real state? So Russia, China, North Korea, whom we're told have extremely sophisticated hackers and who are constantly trying to probe and penetrate our defences, both public sector organisations like our hospitals or very large corporations and banks too. How successfully do you think our new cyber command will be able to, and how ready will they be to go on the offensive against the likes of Russia and China?
The role of the new cyber command, as it's been announced, is actually a role on the battlefield. It's to enable our own armed forces to survive and to be able to fight in the sort of conditions which we see today in Ukraine. It's not actually to conduct the kind of strategic operations that the National Cyber Force was set up for 5 years ago. What that relies on, it's what the experts call the doctrine of cognitive effect. You want to change the mindset of your adversary to deter them from doing what they otherwise would want to do, or make it harder for them. What the new command that's been announced will be able to do is operate very fast indeed on the battlefield, so that as the Ukrainians have demonstrated in the last year or so, they can counter the attacks that are on them. And because you've got to remember that a modern battlefield, as we've seen in Ukraine, is transparent. Your troops can't move. Their locations will be known. The drones are constantly surveilling. So you're going to need some really quite smart technology, digital technology, to target where the adversary, the enemy is, and then get that information to your artillery, to your aircraft, to your missiles, so that you can then attack very fast indeed. So we should think of what's been announced as a real step up for the British Armed Forces' ability to survive and fight on the battlefield. But it is separate from the strategic work that the National Cyber Force, which will continue to be in being.
Indeed.
They
in
would
fact,
do.
We've got a defence review that is about to be unveiled. It's going to be unveiled on Monday. It'll be interesting to see how much more we learn about this and about the broader review next week. So David Omand, former director of GCHQ, thank you very much indeed for joining us on Times Radio.
I don't think we've been behind the curve, John. I think what the Defence Secretary has done is, in his announcement yesterday, is probably formalise the fact that defence now sees cyber as one of the four domains alongside land, sea and air, and therefore the need to build a capability to counter that, and an integrated capability means that we can probably be more open about having and how we deploy that capability than would otherwise be the case. So I don't think it's necessarily that we're behind the curve on that. I think we're probably, and the Defence Secretary is probably just recognising the fact that cyber is now a legitimate domain of warfare.
Right. Look, military leaders are saying that the Ministry of Defence counts 90,000 cyber attacks from state-linked sources just since 2023, which is twice as many as in the past 2 years before that. Now, with all of that going on, have we been conducting cyber operations against those adversaries and potential enemies?
Well, John, if I may sort of break this down into kind of two categories within the context of the Defence Secretary's announcement. I think the 90,000 plus, which is a large number, I mean, there's no doubt about that, are what they kind of call sub-threshold state-led cyber attacks against defence. So that's not a kind of attack against our critical national infrastructure in a warfare sense. That is state entities trying to access our military systems, our MOD, in order to intelligence gather, in order to disrupt, in order to be able to inhibit our ability to be able to develop. So I think that we've always got to be quite careful about the terminology. I feel when we talk about cyber attack, there is kind of hostile cyber activity, which is just an ongoing state-on-state activity, and cyber attack in the way that it is perceived, which is an act of war. And I think Cyber Command has been built to do one of two things. It is to be able to mainstream cyber as one of the domains within the normal rules of warfare and the normal integrated rules of warfare. And it is there to be able to defend the systems of the MOD itself, which can range from just building stronger systems which counter these 90,000 attempted attacks, moving towards the kind of more active defence. So I think, if I may, there's a level of subtle difference between the two elements, but having that capability within defence to be able to carry out both those activities is probably a very wise move, and it will be expensive, which is why the Defence Secretary will have trailed it as part of the Strategic Defence Review in order to be able to explain why the defence budget is going to go up.
Well, and I do want to move on to what our cyber defences are going to look like, when this work and development is taking place. But even if we take it that those 90,000 mentioned cyber attacks have not been lethal, they have been disruptive, they've been spying, they've all been pretty aggressive in their intent. Have we been carrying out comparable operations against those adversaries?
I mean, I think in I suppose way, John, I couldn't possibly, even from my position now, I'm no longer in government, couldn't commentate on what the UK government does or doesn't do in the cyber domain. I think what I will say is the UK cyber security capability and its capability around the ability to use those tools has been evolving for a long time. We're highly capable. We're one of the most capable nations in the world. And I think how we deploy that capability in our active sense, in a defensive sense, has always been one for the government to disclose.
Yeah.
And so that's what I say about us being, I don't think we're behind the curve. I think we are probably one of the most advanced nations in the world at this, which is why we are such a valuable member of NATO, a member of the alliance. But it's an incredibly quickly evolving landscape. The technology that's needed to fight wars is developing faster and faster. And I think to be able to do this under the radar, if you forgive the military pun, it's now no longer a way to do it. And it probably just needs a little bit more visibility because simply of the amount of effort that's needed to put in to counter it.
Right. I mean, I suppose it's reassuring to hear that we have the sort of cyber muscle that we need. But if that's the case, that's saying quite a lot, isn't it? Because I've been reading for a long time that China, for example, has got a force of personnel engaged in cyber operations much bigger than the British Army.
Mm-hmm. Oh, indeed. I mean, generally the size of Chinese everything is larger than most nations, and I think yes, there is an element of scale, but I think there is also the other element, John, and I probably would say this is that the Chinese and some of our other state adversaries are pretty indiscriminate in what they do, and they are highly aggressive in this space. The UK tends to be a lot more balanced in how it uses such capability. It operates under a lot more constraint. It involves a lot more responsibility, and we are not naturally a hostile country. So I think there's a level of proportion there. But I think to be able to have the ability to be able to counter the kind of capability our larger adversaries are building, the Chinese being one, and there are other nations as well, does require this ability for defense to have this integrated defense system where our ability to be able to do this is greater known and greater understood, which in and of itself acts as a deterrent. And unfortunately, I think cyber as part of an integrated capability is just a reality of not only modern warfare, but of state-on-state tensions. And I think it's reflective of the capability need to operate in the 21st century.
Let's talk about tension then in the context of Russia, and because since the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, we've got used to hearing Vladimir Putin and those around him threatening nuclear escalation. It's almost a weekly event, and different people will have different views on how seriously to take that saber rattling. And how worried do you think we should be about cyber escalation, as it were, in peacetime? Because there is a capacity there to do considerable harm.
I think that's a very, very good point, John, because I think what one goes back to my analogy in saying there is kind of offensive cyber in a military sense. But I've always been of the view that hostile cyber activity, that below the threshold stuff, which doesn't cross the barriers of war, is always allows greater capability, greater reach for our adversaries. And so I think that kind of pernicious perpetual hostile activity from the Russians and from other nations is growing. And I think once again I think what we be it with that's why there's so much drive from the National Cybersecurity Centre more widely and from the defence itself to be able to build our own resilience, build our own capability to defend from that, and then pivot from that in whatever mechanism we need. But I think you're right. I think state-on-state hostile activity below the threshold of war is getting more and more dangerous when one looks at it through the cyber prism.
Yeah. The figure of £1 billion has been mentioned for this cyber defence and an offensive capability budget. Is that enough? And how would that be spent, roughly?
I think I would probably say £1 billion, to yourself and your listeners and myself sounds an awful lot of money. What I would say within that context is, remember, defence is trying to build an entirely new domain, the equivalent in capability of an army, a navy, and an air force. £1 billion, I think, at this point sounds enough to be able to get the structures around it right and start investing in the right kind of high-end integratable technology that will tie together the domains and build that capability. Would I say, here, please, Rachel Reeves, please can we have £1 billion and we won't ask any more ever for military defence, I think is fundamentally wrong. I don't think that will happen. And I think this plays into the debate, if I may, about what the size of the defence budget should be when we are looking at a far more complex military landscape. And how much is that going to cost? I sense £1 billion is enough to be able to put some structure around what we already have, but grow it, scale it in terms of what the people we need, the technologies we need, the relationship with the technology industries we need. I think that is just the very lower levels of the slope. I think that's just the inevitability of defence in the 21st century.
And is that a polite way of saying that even with £1 billion, we're still going to be underdefended?
I think that's underdefended. I think is probably quite strong, because bear in mind, a lot of this is around making sure our capabilities are integrated. The land, sea, air, cyber is integrated. So I think some of the capabilities we already have, they're just not integrated as well as they could be. And I think there is also an element of defence itself has to adjust and change and absorb this. And I think there is an element of making sure that allocation of sufficient funds to keep that evolution going while the next following phases are developed is wider than simply saying, here you are, here's £100 billion, go and spend it as you will, because this is the inevitability of an evolutionary process. So I think that's what I always would say is £1 billion, I don't think is the beginning and the end. It is just a very small beginning, which will help scope how quickly that moves to 5 billion, 10 billion, alongside the continued updating of our traditional three domains, land, sea and air. It's a very challenging time for defence.
Brian, really good to hear from you. Thank you. Brian Lord there, former Deputy Director of Intelligence and Cyber Operations at GCHQ.